This content is brought to you by Uphold, which makes crypto investing easy. I've been a user of Uphold since 2017. They're one of my go-to exchanges. You can buy, sell, and trade cryptocurrencies on Uphold. You can also trade precious metals and equities. They have 10 plus million users, 250 plus cryptocurrencies, and they're available in 150 countries. As with all exchanges, you can buy and sell on them, but I highly recommend you custody your own crypto, not your keys, not your coins. If you'd like to learn more about Uphold, please visit the link in the description. Welcome back to the Thinking Crypto podcast, your home for cryptocurrency news and interviews. With me today is Matt Hougan, who's the Chief Investment Officer at Bitwise Asset Management. Matt, it's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be back.
Well, Matt, as soon as I heard BlackRock was applying for a Bitcoin Spot ETF, I thought of you because of your plethora of experience at ETF.com, obviously being CEO there. And I got to get your thoughts on everything that's been going on. But let's start with Bitwise. What's new? What's the latest there?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And you're right. ETFs and crypto occupy the center of my heart. So when you combine the two, it's really exciting. Bitwise is doing well. You know, we're 60 people now. We've been growing aggressively. As a reminder, we serve mostly a professional audience. Our customer count has doubled in the last year, which is a sign that the professional investors continue to move into this space, maybe slower than people wanted, although we'll talk about why I think that's going to change, but they continue to progress. The other things that we've done at Bitwise over the last, let's say, year are introduce a handful of new strategies. We've introduced separately managed accounts, which have been very popular, let people own crypto directly while we manage the strategy on top of them. And we even launched a hedge fund of funds that invests in other hedge funds in the space as a way of providing a lower volatility exposure to the crypto market. So more products, more customers, more people, but still doing the same thing, which is helping investors access this really exciting market of crypto. And it's very exciting to talk to them about that today, because I think we're in an interesting moment for the market.
For sure. And, you know, you mentioned your customers doubled, the number doubled. Was that before this news that we've been seeing? And which is interesting because last year was a rough year for the market, of course. It seems like they were not dismayed by that. I guess they see the long-term view of this market.
Yeah. I think that's right. It was before this news. Now, to be clear, our assets didn't double. So what we saw was an increasing number of professional investors dipping their toe in the water. And the big question is when they're going to jump off the dock into the water fully. And I think this news that we saw recently is going to convince them that the water is warm and that they can come on it.
So I was talking about it in a recent podcast. I feel like we've hit a tipping point of institutional adoption of crypto, because after the BlackRock news, all of a sudden, a bunch of other companies started throwing their hat in the ring for a spot ETF. And you had big announcements of Fidelity, Charles Schwab, and Citadel launching a crypto exchange, which is pretty amazing. What is your take on BlackRock being the first domino to fall here?
Yeah, I think it's really important. It's important for two reasons. The obvious reason that everyone's talking about is that it's a signal that arguably the most sophisticated ETF provider in the world, right? BlackRock is the biggest ETF provider. They have a 575-1 record of getting their ETFs approved. So that's pretty good. Arguably the most sophisticated ETF investor in the world thinks that the regulators are prepared in the near term to approve a spot Bitcoin ETF. And of course, that's big news because a spot Bitcoin ETF is likely to attract significant assets, which should be supportive of prices. But I actually think there's a bigger long-term impact, which is what you pointed to. The other thing the BlackRock news says, and this is echoed by Fidelity, Charles Schwab, Citadel, others coming into this market, Deutsche Bank becoming a custodian, Societe Generale in France, the largest bank, becoming a custodian, is that the world's largest asset manager and its peers are saying Bitcoin is here to stay. And if Bitcoin is here to stay, it seems extraordinarily unlikely that it's going to be a sub-trillion-dollar asset for long. That, to me, is actually a bigger statement than the spot Bitcoin ETF. When the world's largest asset manager with $10 trillion in assets says institutional investors are going to want exposure to Bitcoin today, tomorrow, 5 years, and 10 years into the future. To me, that's a sea change. It means we're entering a mainstream era of crypto. It means crypto is going to take its place in portfolios alongside gold, real estate, other alternative investments. It means apps are going to go mainstream. I think we're going to look back on this as sort of the cannon shot that announced that we're in this mainstream era, and I think it's a phase shift. I think it's really important.
And just in the days following BlackRock's news of submitting an application, we saw Wisdom Tree and Invesco and a bunch of other companies, some reapplying and some entering the game as new applicants. Tell us about Bitwise, because I believe you guys also had an application in for a spot ETF. What's the dynamic there with your application and any updates around it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we first filed for a spot Bitcoin ETF when I was 7 years old. So we've been doing this for a while. No, seriously, we've done 2 previous rounds. In each case, in 2019 and 2021, we thought we had figured out an argument that would convince the SEC that the market was ready for a spot Bitcoin ETF. And each time the SEC came back and said, no, we're not ready yet. I think what BlackRock is looking at and what we're looking at and what Invesco is looking at and what others are looking at is this market has really matured, right? You'll remember from our previous conversations, the big question is, can you have a surveillance sharing agreement between the exchange that is listing the ETF and a market that's important in crypto, a significant market of significant size? And the SEC insists on that. So if there's any funny business in the underlying market, it can investigate it and make sure everything's clear. And we've been arguing that the CME, a regulated futures market, has been that market for years.
Right.
I think what BlackRock is saying and what we're saying now is 2 things. One, the CME market has grown up, right? It's really big right now. It has a lot of institutional investors. It's shown its proving power. It's been around for many years. There's even a futures ETF that tracks those futures, and the SEC is okay with that. That's a strong endorsement that market is really mature and that the underlying market is mature. What BlackRock did that's clever is they are creating a surveillance sharing agreement with a large spot exchange. We would assume it's Coinbase, and that should provide additive color. I think what's unique about the Bitwise application, I can't say more than what's in our filing, is we've augmented that with significant research showing just how important the CME market is. But look, if you step back from 30,000 feet and you think of this story since the first ETF application was filed way back, I think in 2013, even if you're pro crypto, you have to say that the market has come a long way.
Oh, yeah.
Right? We were dealing with Mt. Gox then. We're dealing with Coinbase, Anchorage, and Fidelity now from a custody perspective. Spreads were a mile wide then, and you can trade Bitcoin at penny wide spreads. There was no regulated futures market then. And now there's billions of dollars of open interest from mainstream institutions trading on the CME every day. And I think what we're saying, what BlackRock is saying, what Invesco is saying is the time is right. We're ready. It's mature. Let's go. Let's give investors a safe, cheap way to access this market.
So, Matt, kind of an awkward question to ask you, and maybe a tough one, because I'm looking at it from a different perspective. You're obviously on the building side. You're seeing things that myself and other investors are not. Some folks are a bit turned off that, okay, the SEC has denied Bitwise and all these folks, right, for years. BlackRock all of a sudden comes along. What if they get their Bitcoin spot ETF approved first? What does that say about the regulator and control of the markets? Like, is that fair? Even though, let's say your application, may get approved along with the others, but it's like, hey, these guys were here in line before BlackRock. Why is BlackRock skipping the line? And Grayscale is, of course, suing the SEC. What are your thoughts on all that whole situation?
Yeah, I already have fairly red skin. If that happened, I would turn beet red and want to explode. I do think that would be unfair. There's a lot of people, Bitwise for sure, but other providers as well, who have done a lot of work in this space. And my hope and expectation is that the SEC will line up the leading providers and let multiple ETFs launch at once, and let the best company win, or let them divide the market in an appropriate way. For what it's worth, that would be best for the investors as well, because competition will bring down prices and increase quality. And so I think that would be really important. The SEC has it within its discretion to make that decision. And actually, if you look back at the history of ETFs, there have been examples where there have been multiple competing efforts, and the SEC lined different companies up and let them launch at the same time. I think that would be the fairest thing. And I'm hopeful that happened. And if it doesn't happen, yeah, absolutely, I would be upset, frustrated, and angry.
Yeah, and I'm hoping, to your point, I hope they do it right and they approve multiple at the same time. Now, I know we've talked about this a lot, but I think for the new listeners, I think it'd be helpful to understand why an ETF, a spot ETF, is important. What are the benefits? If we can give a quick rundown there.
Yeah, absolutely. So for a retail investor, the primary importance is that a spot ETF is going to drive down the price of accessing Bitcoin, because it's this very efficient mechanism that mainstream firms can access the space. The more scale that is, the lower the cost. So as a retail investor, you're probably fine buying Bitcoin on Coinbase or buying Bitcoin through another application. There's nothing wrong with that. All you're going to see is that the cost of doing that is going to come down aggressively, and that's going to benefit you. The other big benefit is for many traditional investors who are not crypto native, who hold most of their money in a brokerage account, and particularly for financial advisors, the people who, help other people invest, they can't access crypto through things like Coinbase or things like PayPal or the other applications. They need an ETF. It fits into their plumbing. And the secret of the world is that institutions and financial advisors control about 80% of the wealth in America. So there's 80% of the wealth that has a very hard time accessing the space. And after an ETF is launched, it'll be push button easy for them to do it. So it will bring this whole new class of investors into the market in a way they can't right now. And then as a retail investor, even if you never buy a spot Bitcoin ETF, even if you love to buy it on exchange and then hold it in cold storage, God bless, it's going to be cheaper for you to do that. So you should be excited about it as well. It is really a win-win-win in the marketplace.
Yeah, it just opens up floods of capital to come into Bitcoin and the crypto asset class. So question for you, you look at the gold chart when a gold ETF was approved, and it was like this exponential parabolic rise. Do you think we see something like that? Bitcoin already moves it doesn't move like anything I've ever seen, as far as charts. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but do you think we see that exponential rise as well?
Look, the one thing that's really true about Bitcoin, as you know, is they're only 21 million. They're not going to make any more than that. And so if you have new capital coming into the market and there's a fixed supply, and there are a lot of people who aren't comfortable selling their Bitcoin anywhere near the current prices, it should be additive for price. It should be beneficial. Now, one interesting thing about that gold chart, and this is something that I think most people get wrong, so maybe this is an important tip, is that it took a while. There was an initial bump, and there was a lot of money that came into the gold ETF. But if you think about like the money that came in, it didn't go like that. It had a bump, and then it flattened, and then the long-term impact actually took 5 or 6 years. Right. And I think that will be true here. I don't think this is a 1 month story, a 2 month story, a 3 month story. I think it's a 3 to 5 to 10 year story. But absolutely, bringing professional capital into crypto when there's a fixed supply of Bitcoin should be beneficial for prices over the long term. Of course, it could be volatile along the way, and there's plenty of risk.
Yeah, great point. That it will take some time to ramp up, and as these folks build out the pipeline and all that. So on that note, Bitcoin's price has been rallying recently. It's a very similar move to what we saw in 2019 after a big blow off top correction bear market and then a rally. And then we got the halving next year. Are you seeing the same 4-year cycles playing out here? Similar timeline and new all-time high possibly in 2025?
Yeah, yes is the short answer to that. Of course, there's risk. Of course, it may not happen. There's no guarantee. Past performance is no guarantee of future returns. But if you look back at crypto, it has moved in this 4-year cycle. There's a big technological or market breakthrough. It creates this level of excitement. You get boom years, and then there's a retrenchment. We saw that with Bitcoin being available in 2011. That's when Coinbase launched. That was when Mt. Gox launched. Huge bull market. We saw it in 2015 to 2017 with the launch of Ethereum. Huge bull market. We saw it 2019 to 2021 with the launch of DeFi, NFTs, stablecoins. Huge bull market. And then a reset. We've gone through the reset. And like you said, do you remember back to 2019? It felt a lot like the first 5 months of this year. Yeah. Bitcoin's price rose, but everyone was just depressed.
Yeah.
All the headlines were bad. It was painful to open your computer in the morning. Bitcoin sort of climbed the wall of worry, but no one paid attention to it. And then we got multiple. That's what it feels like. The first 5 months of this was like the most depressing bull market in Bitcoin's history. It was up 60%, but all the news flow was bad. I do think we've changed that psychology with this BlackRock news. I think it's turned people's minds around. When we talk to people in the field, there's a new level of excitement and urgency. I'm just very excited, and I do think it's a multi-year bull market. Look, this is a big phase shift. It's not an overnight thing, and of course there'll be more negative news. There'll be more negative headlines. There'll be more volatility. Look at my hair. It's totally gray. That is driven by Bitcoin's volatility. It's going to continue, but I'm very optimistic about where we're going over the next, couple of years.
For sure. And to your point, the first 5 months, we saw a lot of headwinds in the United States from regulatory agencies like the SEC, a lot of enforcement actions, some controversial because it included some of the highly regulated exchanges like Coinbase and Paxos and these folks. What are your thoughts on those enforcement actions? And I know this is a very big conversation because we need Congress to act. And the regulators seem to be a little bit out of control themselves, playing whack-a-mole. So, what are your thoughts? And could we see some sort of resolution soon with Congress acting?
Yeah, I think we could. First, let's give a charitable view to the regulators. 2022 was pretty bad. Yeah. There were some pretty big blowups. There was Luna, there was Three Arrows, there was FTX. Anytime that happens in any industry, you're going to see a regulatory response. And that regulatory response is going to be the regulators lashing out with enforcement actions. I actually don't think there's anything that surprising about this. And if we look at ourselves in the mirror, we should say that crypto can do better, right? Oh. Crypto exchanges can do better. Yeah. Crypto custodians can do better. Crypto investors can do better. We can have better disclosures. So the charitable view is it was natural and actually needed. But I do think they're, my personal view is they're overreaching and they're putting America at risk of falling behind other nations that are marching forward. But I'm very hopeful for what's going on in Congress. You're seeing real progress on bipartisan bills that would provide a reasonable framework. Look, this is not that complicated. Mm-hmm. We should disclose the risks in crypto, and we should allow for decentralized platforms to innovate. We should be able to do both of those things. America always figures it out. It tries everything else, as that old quote goes, but eventually it gets to the right answer. I'm confident we'll get there, in the next year or two.
Yeah, and there've been you mentioned some bills. There's like the Lummis-Gillibrand bill. I know Patrick McHenry and Congressman Glenn Thompson put out a really good bill recently, draft-wise. So I'm hoping one of those get through and we get clarity. Is there any that is on your radar that you think might be ideal? I know there's been a few.
Yeah, I think the McHenry bill is a great template. I think both bills are good, but the McHenry bill is a great template for how we could get the kind of clarity we need as an industry to move forward. And I do think we'll get there. I would remind the audience, particularly if you haven't been around crypto for a while, we've had previous regulatory crackdowns. 2013 shut down Silk Road. That was good for crypto, even though it hurt at the time. 2018, the regulators shut down fraudulent ICOs. That was good for crypto long term, even though it hurt at the time. And so just because there's some painful regulatory crackdowns right now, if we get this legislation, it's a massive unlock. It goes from a negative to a very strong positive. It contributes to this mainstreaming of crypto. And I think if we see the McHenry bill gather momentum now, next year, in the future, if we're moving in that direction, that's what's important. I would just add one more thing. The Coinbase SEC lawsuit, those other lawsuits, those will take multiple years to resolve.
Sure.
I feel pretty confident that the resolution is going to come from the legislature. So I would keep my eyes focused on that. I think that's where the answer will be, and I'm very optimistic about what we get there.
And what's fascinating, in addition to Congress members, putting out draft bills and so forth, we're seeing potential presidential candidates have crypto on their ballot, and it's become a point of their campaign. And RFK Jr., even Governor Ron DeSantis, talking about CBDCs and Bitcoin. What are your thoughts on that? That's very interesting. I think it's like a big shift that this is a ballot issue now.
It's a massive shift. And I think it's indicative of how popular crypto is. Look, there are tens, maybe 100 million people in the US who own crypto. And there are a lot of people who care about innovation. And they don't want it squelched by legislators and others who don't understand what this market is really about. I do think it's really notable that it's become a campaign issue. Like, imagine that 4 or 5 years ago, you would sound like a total kook suggesting that it would be mentioned in presidential debates. And here we are. It talks about how far the industry has come, and I think it's a good footing for how far we're going to go.
Do you feel we've lost any ground, given that EU has the MiCA bill, the UK, they're moving so fast? I'm seeing a lot of firms are expanding to the UK, meeting with their prime minister and so forth. Or do you think it's still, we could still win some of that business back and bring some of that capital back? Look, the US is the largest capital market in the world. I don't know, for me, it feels like we've lost some ground, but maybe it's easily we can gain it back again.
Yeah, I think that's right. We have lost some ground, and some great founders have moved abroad. I've talked to them as they're getting on planes, moving to Europe to build in those markets, and we should be sad about that. But this is the largest market in the world. It's the greatest market in the world. Eventually, our country will figure it out. It is the home of innovation, and I think you will see that. But we are living in an increasingly globalized world, and this is a global asset class, and smart innovators will go where there is fairness and a balance between investor protections and innovation. But I am hopeful, and I do think we'll get our mojo back in the US. It's coming.
I want to get your thoughts, and I think we've talked about it before, but SEC versus Ripple, because boy, there's been a lot of developments here. Certain documents released from SEC officials, and a lot of folks in the industry are looking to and hoping Ripple gets a victory, because we see the SEC is going after a lot of different altcoins. Like in a recent lawsuit against Binance, they named Cardano, Matic, Solana, some of which I was very surprised by. What are your thoughts here, and what would a win for Ripple do for the industry?
Yeah, a win for Ripple, if it happened, would be a huge win for crypto. You would see a significant rally, because it would mean that the definition of what is a security and what is not a security is more open to crypto than the SEC thinks. And we've certainly seen, for all the rally we've seen in Bitcoin and Ethereum, we've seen altcoins significantly suffer as a result of the Coinbase lawsuit, because of the uncertainty that interjects into that ecosystem, which I think is a rational response. So a Ripple win would be significant. It is significant even that it's been so difficult for the SEC. If you remember the day the SEC lawsuit hit, it was very well written. I think people were like, whoa, Ripple doesn't stand a chance. Turns out they definitely stand a chance. And whether they win or lose, I think it suggests that this question is more complex than maybe a layperson would believe. But yes, for sure, if they win, it's a huge win for crypto. And you'd see a significant rally, particularly in the altcoin space.
Yeah, for sure. And even with, I think it was Bill Hinman, who was previously at the SEC, in his documents released or emails, you see the confusion among the SEC folks. Like, one is saying one thing, the other is saying the other, and there's disagreements. So it's even more clear now that Congress needs to act. Because the SEC themselves, they're not all on the same page. I think we've seen Commissioner Hester Peirce and some of the other commissioners also dissent from actions the SEC has taken. And then we have the industry starting to fight back. So Coinbase is suing the SEC. Binance is going on the attack there. And look, I know the regulators are not perfect. I know sometimes, look, people are not happy with Gary Gensler. They think he gets a bit too political and all that. And my hope is Congress steps in and fixes all of this and throw some water on all this stuff, because it's pretty crazy.
That is exactly right. We need Congress to step in. And look, there is a direct conflict, right? So the SEC wants to apply security laws to crypto, but truly decentralized entities can't comply with existing securities laws. So that would be extremely destructive to innovation. And I think we all want decentralized platforms to be able to exist. I think there are very few people who think they should not exist. At the same time, there are plenty of early stage crypto projects that probably fit the definition of securities and probably should have to do more disclosures. This is a perfect case where the existing rules don't fit the existing reality. And that's where Congress needs to step in. In fact, there are many people who believe it's not the SEC's right to step into that space. Congress needs to step in and add clarity. And all we will get from that is greater investor protection, more innovation and economic growth. And I think everyone should see that. Everyone should be behind that. And I'm hopeful that that's where we're going to end up.
Yeah, well put. Matt, always great information, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I love these conversations, and thanks for what you do for the space. It's really important.
Thank you.